Hi there and welcome. My name is Adriel Booker. I'm your host of Tethered, and I am just so pleased to be joining you today for my study here at my home in Sydney, Australia. We live in Gadigal land, and so thankful to be here. I've got my guest here today is Dr. Mekel Harris. She's joining us from Tennessee in the USA. Hello, Mekel.
Hi, Adriel. It is a pleasure to see your beautiful face yet again.
I feel the same way. I am so thrilled to have you. I just want to introduce you to everyone a little bit, tell them some of your background. Dr. Harris is a licensed pediatric and family health psychologist. She currently serves in private practice, offering psychological evaluation and support to children, adolescents, and families. She also offers training and education, consultative and supervisory services to several organizations throughout the Memphis area. Dr. Harris has done pre and post doctorate training at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. She specializes in coping and adjustment to acute and chronic illness, grief, loss, and health-related trauma. She has presented at domestic and international conferences focused on pediatric family and community health issues. I'm sure you're getting the idea here that Dr. Harris is an absolute deep well of wisdom and skill and expertise. She's also the author of Relaxing into Pain, My Journey into Grief and Beyond, which I want to ask her about today as well. And of course, the important bit, she enjoys writing and traveling around the globe and spending time with family, friends, and her feisty beagle, which I don't have a name for your beagle, so I don't know if that was important information, but I'm just so happy to have you here with us, Dr. Harris. It is just a joy to welcome you to Tethered.
Thank you again. And yeah, his name is Seven, which is a
7.
long story. Yeah, seven is the number of completion. And I am waiting for him to be completed in his puppiness. So we're waiting to see how that goes.
And will he get a name change when he graduates from puppiness, or is
I
it
think so. I
7?
think I think we're gonna upgrade him to 8. I'm waiting for the 8.0 version of him to show up.
Oh, well, it's so good to have you. And, I want to talk to you about a few things just related to even just starting and setting the tone for Tethered. I'm really hoping that people will watch our session together before they dive into some of the other sessions. But I thought it would be great, Mekel, if just as you start, could you share with us a little bit of your story? Give us a context of who you are, what's shaped your Christian faith and your Christian identity, and would just really love to hear some of that backstory.
Yeah, so my Christian faith has literally been shaped by life and all the challenges that come between that. I'll always like to think about that gap between what we expect our life to look like and the things that are going to happen and the reality of what it is.
Oh, it's a
Um,
wide gap.
oh my gosh, the older I get, it feels like the wider sometimes it gets.
Mm,
But that really has helped keep me focused on faith, which is literally the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen.
mm,
I'm constantly reminded that what faith is, I can't tangibly see, but I've got to lean into those spaces. And so there have been really some pivotal events that have helped shape and deepen my faith in God, namely related to loss. You
mm.
mentioned just my experiences with grief and loss and death and dying. And of course, that was all professional. But on a personal level, I can completely relate to that waiting period, that tension period, and that overwhelm that happens in the space of grief. So, um, leading up to 2012, I would say that I had entered my 30s and was really living my best life. I was living in California, enjoying the beach in the morning and the mountains in the evening, and just experiencing everything that I desired things to be. And
Mm.
little did I know that later on that year, within a 30-day time span, that my mom would go from a diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer to her death. And so
Mm.
that became this really uncomfortable, overwhelming, painful experience that I was in and lived in and live in
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
followed by several other significant deaths. About 5 years later, my other beagle, who I desperately loved and had him for 15 and a half years, he died. And so that was kind of the second pivotal loss in my life. And most recently, actually March of this year, my dad passed away. And so
Mm,
death is something
I'm
that has
sorry.
literally shaped, thank you. It has literally shaped everything about who I am and
Yeah.
has deepened my faith in God on so many levels.
Now, as a professional,
Hmm.
um, did you feel when your mom died in particular, that was sort of your introduction to significant grief?
Hmm.
Did you feel equipped for that because you knew how to walk other people through it? What's it like when the tables are turned, so to speak? And it's wow, my head is filling with terrible cliches right now. When the rubber hits the road, that's the thing that
Yeah.
popped into my mind. But what's that like for you when you've actually got to walk out and practice
Hmm.
some of what you've known professionally, but now it's your lived experience? What was that like?
Yeah, I think one of my first reactions was to almost pick up the phone and call every client who I had met prior to my mom's death and apologize
Oh no.
for really some of the silly cliche things that we say in the spirit of comforting people,
Hmm.
not realizing the depth of that for myself at that point. Now, of course, I'm being a little over dramatic, but I think it really helped deepen the reality that grief is complicated and it's
Yes.
messy and it's hard, and there are no right things to say in that. So, what I think grief really did after I took some time away, I was working in grief and loss in my private practice at the time. And so I had to step away from that for several months. And when I came back, it really sharpened my clinical skills, if you will, and it really made me
Hmm.
much more of a keen listener. Of course, I
Hmm.
had been trained in listening, but the reality was I don't think I was listening to the spirit of the situation. I was listening to the surface,
Yeah.
not the message behind the message.
Yeah.
And after experiencing my mom's death, it really opened my eyes to the importance of really sitting in the depths of loss and pain and suffering with people. And it also humbled me to realize that really, no matter how many letters are behind your name, if you cannot sit with someone and literally embrace the weight of what they're experiencing, it doesn't matter. That really became more important to me than theories and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it opened my eyes to presence, which is so critical in the grief process, as you know.
I do. I'm reading a book right now, actually, by Dr. Jim Wilder
Hmm.
and Dallas Willard, and he's also a psychologist, and Dr. Wilder, and
Hmm.
um, and he's talking about how in all of in all of his professional training, you really train to differentiate from the client, detach, not be emotionally involved. And then
Yeah.
you've got, of course, Dallas Willard, who's a theologian, and his whole life is about helping people to use different spiritual practices and connect um, with others and with the
Yeah.
relational, with the triune God and with those around. And so it's kind of this conversation between the two of them
Hmm.
before Dallas passed away, about even that need for as a professional being able to still love, and as
Hmm.
a Christian, putting yourself in the place of love and attachment. And I think reading this has been so insightful to me because I'm not a professional in the way that you are. So I haven't had that circumstance, but I have been in
Hmm.
ministry for 20 years, and I have
Right.
been a mentor for a long time. And that tension between not wanting to become quote unquote too emotionally involved with those you're walking alongside, and yet needing
Hmm.
to enter into that place of empathy and love, and
Yeah.
that can feel really difficult. So
Well, what's
how
been
did you,
so
yeah, grapple with that?
yeah, what's been so interesting and what was at the time when I kind of got back into private practice was to listen to these clients who I'd be sitting with and honestly feeling completely inept, thinking in my head, I haven't really done, the textbook thing.
Mm.
I veered away perhaps from the grief theory or whatever. But then when they'd come back to the next visit, they'd say, man, Dr. Harris, that was one of the most profound visits.
Okay.
And I was constantly reminded with this question of what was I bringing in the space in that moment?
Yeah.
And it was presence. And what you're saying, it was humanity. Um,
Yes.
I was trained that we don't really bring ourselves into the room, right? But the reality is, in grief, not only do you have to connect with someone in their pain, I think there is a space, of course, along ethical lines and within limits, to
Mm.
disclose aspects of yourself that let that person know, wow, here's another human that I can connect to spirit, heart to heart. And that is what was and what is the most profound intervention, if you want to call it that, that I utilize in the space with my clients. And I think that's what has made them deeply connected to the process with me.
Yeah. Well, it's a different way really of thinking about
Hmm.
things when you sort of start combining the neuroscience of it with the
Correct.
spirituality of it and the
Correct.
relational aspect. So, okay,
Hmm.
one of the things I really want to do in our time together, because I've got, your wonderful professional expertise, would you help us to define some different types of grief? And what I mean by that is, tethered is really to create a space for people to that have experienced crisis or grief or pain um, of any sort. And
Hmm.
obviously, we're all going to come with a different lens. We're going to come from a different context.
Right.
And we could go through and have a laundry list of different types of scenarios that would cause grief. But I think one thing that's so important to me as we start out looking at grief and faith and the mix of that is that we give people permission, I guess, to name their pain as
Yeah.
grief and give people permission to name their suffering.
Yes.
And sometimes I know for me in my own, lived experience, it's been really important for me to just name things.
Hmm.
And that's helped me to enter in more. So can you help us to understand some of the different types of grief?
Yeah, and I'll talk about this in relationship to just kind of the broad definition of grief. So, grief in its most basic level is the physical, emotional, and spiritual response to a loss.
Hmm.
And the one important thing about grief, as it is with stress or pain in general, is that it's subjective, meaning that
Mm.
what may be weighty and complicated and overwhelming for me may not be for you.
Yeah.
And so you could sit in the space with two people who've experienced a loss and they may be processing that in two different ways,
Hmm.
yet it is subjective. And so, to the extent that an individual is experiencing overwhelm and pain associated with a loss, that's what it is. So, that's kind of the broad definition of grief. And then I think when you start to unpack different types of grief within that, I'll really focus on a couple of different types. One that I want to focus on is complicated grief, right? Um, which I always wrestle with this classification, this category of grief, because all grief is complicated. So I don't necessarily like the term complicated grief, but when we want to differentiate that from kind of typical grief reactions, the key variable there is how debilitating it is. With complicated grief, we tend to see that people are experiencing much more functional impairment, meaning that they're having a hard time returning to their normal activities, right? It's beyond just having that weightiness that we all have felt along the grief journey. This is, I'm having a hard time going to work. I have stopped taking care of my personal self. I've disconnected completely from the social environment. So, very debilitating effects. And I think that's where it gleans the name complicated, because there's much more of a debilitating aspect to it. Whereas with
Yeah.
typical grief, right, you tend to see people after a period of time. And I want to say that that time varies from person to person. There is not a moving on, but a moving through the grief journey. to where
Mm.
that person can get back into some sense of a new normal and function within their day-to-day lives. So that's the difference between
Mhm.
those two.
Mhm. You just said new normal in
Oh,
2020. Bingo.
yes, that's what it is. We're all grieving. We're all grieving expectations
Oh.
this year, right? But
Yeah,
it really
yeah.
is a new
It's hard.
normal. So then
Yeah.
the other type of grief I wanted to point out was what's considered ambiguous grief, right? This might
Mhm.
also be what may be considered abstract grief, right? So this is grief associated with a loss that lacks clarity, or a loss that can lead to different views about what was lost and the impact of the loss. So an
Mhm.
example of this would be something like a miscarriage, right? Part of that related to differing views around the beginning of life, right?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
an unborn child in the womb may not be perceived as a significant loss to some based upon their worldview, whereas to that woman who's experienced the loss, it's a tremendous thing.
Yeah.
So ambiguous losses can create a lot of internal angst, partly because of the way that other people may or may not respond to the visibility, if you will, of the loss.
Yeah.
So that's kind of ambiguous loss.
And with that, as you know, I work with women who've experienced pregnancy loss and
Hmm.
families. Um, and one of the things that was illuminating to me, I guess, when I started some of this work, was that some some women in particular that because, as you said, we all have a different worldview, of
Hmm.
where life begins. Is it at conception? Is it at implantation? Is it at viability? Is it at breath?
Hmm.
And so on. And I have worked with women who um, would have sort of a definition of where life begins that's perhaps later in a pregnancy,
Hmm.
and they've miscarried or they've lost their baby before that point in their mind, and
Hmm.
yet they still grieve because it's not that they're not necessarily grieving, well, I've lost this baby or this life, but it's that loss of the life to come and the dream to come.
Hmm.
And so it's a really messy. Ambiguous is such a good word because it is
Yes.
hard to put definition around some of that, and we do land at different places, don't we?
Hmm. We do. And I think related to that is a completely different category of grief, which is disenfranchised grief.
Yes.
So this is also very similar to ambiguous grief in the sense that there's a societal perspective related to it. So an example of this would be grief where there's a stigma perhaps associated with the death. So
Hmm.
examples may include things like suicide,
Hmm.
or a person who dies of HIV or AIDS related complications.
Mm.
If a person succumbed to an accident and they were the cause as a result of alcohol consumption, for example,
Right.
there may be a stigma associated with that type of death, which makes it really hard for the grieving person because
Yes.
they may not receive the social support that they desperately need because others may, I don't want to use the word rejoice, but there may be a complete lack of understanding about
Yeah.
why they would be grieving in the first place.
Yes. Or
So
somehow justify it, or
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, we
Wow.
see this sometimes with health related deaths where
Hmm.
people may respond with, well, the person, their behavior led them down a path. For example, with drug addiction, we see this.
Yeah.
And the reality is, again, for that grieving person, that person's death is still a death and a loss and a significant loss.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But to the community, sometimes those losses are minimized, which can create a lot of internal distress for the
Yeah.
surviving person.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
why is it important to be able to name some of those different types of grief? How does that help us, just as humans, not as
Hmm.
clients, but just as humans trying to understand what we're going through? Why does it help to sort of see ourselves, or should we not be trying to categorize ourselves? What would you say to that?
Well, I think from a neurobiological perspective, we are really wired to categorize.
Mhm.
And in some ways, that categorization can help anchor us in the reality that we are indeed normal, right?
Mm.
That we are living a life, we're walking a journey, and there's similarities along that. If we can kind of categorize or group ourselves with others walking a similar path, we feel connected. Which is also a neurobiological process. And so categorization is important. As a clinician, categorization can make some differences in terms of how you might intervene or treat an individual who's wrestling with a particular concern.
Mm.
At the same time, right, I think we can over categorize, and sometimes those labels are less important than the reality that we are simply in pain, which is a
Mm.
universal experience, right?
Yeah.
So I think it really depends on the person and the extent to which they are either under identifying or over identifying with a category. So,
Yeah.
one thing that I want to say here related to it just came to my mind thinking about testimonies. I think sometimes to have the ability to name something is critical because it gives voice to someone else who needs to hear, oh gosh, I've walked that journey too, right?
Absolutely.
At the
Absolutely.
same time, right? At the same time, I've seen clients where the over identification with a category can be problematic because then it becomes an identity where the person's not necessarily using it for the purpose of blessing anyone else, but they become stuck in the identification with that diagnosis or category. So again, I
Mm.
think we have to always be careful as we walk that line of naming but not over identifying with any particular category.
Oh, that's so helpful. I as you know, I've written a book about grief
Mm-hmm.
and to serve people through pregnancy loss. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was starting to write this book, and I knew that I wanted to do this or needed to do this, whatever terminology you want to use. There were lots of times when I didn't want to. It was hard and painful. But
Yes.
one of my great hesitations was I don't want to become the miscarriage lady. I don't want people to just think of Adriel is synonymous with pregnancy loss. There's so much more to my life than this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want that to be my label.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I really had to wrestle that out with God and with myself and my own
Mm-hmm.
ego, to be quite honest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think through that wrestle, I just decided, people are going to label me how they are. Like I have
Mm-hmm.
no choice about that, but I can live under the label myself of my
Yes.
choosing and of,
Yes.
in partnership with God, how he sees me. And I thought, okay, so I don't want to be the miscarriage woman, but you know what? I'll be the hope woman. And
Mm.
I want that naming to be for purpose, and I want it to be for hope. And so I think, and I guess that's what I'm hearing you
Mm-hmm.
say is how do we name in such a way that then doesn't limit us
Right.
to be identified with that thing, but actually gives permission to others to validate them and yet
Absolutely.
find freedom or hope or healing in the midst of that. That's so
Yeah,
good.
I think whatever we walk through, whatever journey we're on along this grief path, or whatever other sort of loss we've experienced, those are vehicles, right,
Mm,
to facilitate hope. They're mechanisms by which we can inspire. They're
yeah.
not simply stop signs, right? But they can become stop signs if we over identify with the problem. And so, again, I think it's so important that we definitely categorize and understand where we are, but really be asking ourselves in relationship to God, how can this grief process, this disenfranchised grief, how can this traumatic grief experience that I've gone
Mm.
through serve as a vehicle to get me and whoever else you have along my path, God, to to understand that there is hope beyond hope in the midst of the pain. That is the most important thing in this journey called life.
Yeah. Yeah. So my first experience with real grief was
Mm-hmm.
actually with our second son, who, when I was about midway through the pregnancy, we were told that he most likely had a chromosomal anomaly that was incompatible with life. And that spun my husband and I into a whole process of examining everything, our
Yeah.
theology, our values, our
Hmm.
beliefs, how we lived and moved in the world. Um, and, I don't want to use our time to tell that story, but that was my introduction.
Yeah.
And then he actually was born fine and totally healthy. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
its whole own story, but
Praise God.
sort of, yes, I'm so grateful. My next real introduction to grief was our third pregnancy, which was when we lost our baby at 12 weeks. And
Mm.
that one for me, that was different because it all of a sudden became very tangible, and that there was an end, to it, an end to this life. And I think in that sort of season of having to grapple with that end of life,
Mm-hmm.
I recognized within myself, look, I have deep wired within me this knee-jerk reaction to want to overcome pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's because I'm American by birth and we are wired to sort of overcome obstacles and rags to riches. We
Mm-hmm.
love a success story. I don't know if it's my personality,
Yeah.
which I am quite a determined, glass half full type person.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of hard work. I wasn't sure if that was my Christian upbringing and just sort of consider it all joy. And,
Mm-hmm.
we are overcomers, and sort of,
Yes.
I wasn't as familiar with the parts of the Bible that allowed us to enter into pain and allowed
Yeah.
us to sit in grief. And, I read the Psalms a million times,
Whew.
hyperbole, but I read the Psalms so many times, but it's almost like I would read over the Psalms of lament and just go, those don't apply to me. I don't understand. But
Yeah.
that season is really, and starting
Mm.
with our son, Judah. And then our first miscarriages, we've had four, but that first one in particular was so
Mm-hmm.
formative because
Wow.
it's like I had to realize that if I was going to, as you say, get through this, not just get over it, I'd have to disarm this knee jerk reaction to try
Absolutely.
and overcome my grief. And that
Yes.
to me was so hard because I felt like everything in me, personality, culture, spiritual background, all of it felt like I was hardwired to just, how can I rewrite this into my success story? Where can I see God's redemption? I'm such
Right.
a good, happy Christian.
Mm-hmm.
You've written a whole book about relaxing into pain. And I
Yeah.
love that terminology. For me, it's disarming the knee jerk,
Mm-hmm.
reaction to overcome. And I think you can disarm that knee jerk, but then you take it a step farther to say, okay, you need to relax into your pain. What does that mean to you? Can you tell us what you mean when you invite us to relax into pain?
Yeah, so I first want to say that the title of the book that I wrote, I cannot take any credit for. I was seated in my therapist's office months after my mom died, literally fighting tooth and nail everything associated with grief. I did
Mm,
not want to be in that club. I did not want people to identify me with death.
mm,
For whatever reason, I felt even a little embarrassed that my mom had died, which sounds so
mm.
strange, perhaps, but I
You were
just
the
didn't.
helper. You had been the helper.
Yeah, I had always been in this particular role, and I
Yeah.
felt weak. There were cultural
Mm,
expectations as a Black woman of what it looked like to be strong, and all of these things were going through my mind. So I was literally fighting tooth and nail. It reminds me of the wrestling that Jacob had with God. Like
mm-hmm.
that was literally me. I also, like Jacob, came out limping. As a physical reminder that, you know what, God's going to be God, but also his grace to let me continue walking through it.
Mm,
But my therapist, after months and months of seeing me come in and say, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm this, let's talk about work. Let's talk about where I'm going to travel around the world, and never naming, I'm sad and I am hurt and I've never felt so gutted in my life.
mm,
I have lost my confidant, my rock, my best friend. I feel like nobody cares. I feel alone. Instead of doing that, I was doing everything else. And she lovingly looked across the room from me and said, Mekel, what do you think it would look like if you relaxed into the pain? So I didn't know at the time. I was actually angry in that visit because I thought, how dare you talk to me about relaxing into any sort of pain that doesn't even make sense for
I
all the
gotta,
reasons
I
that
gotta
you.
ask you a question.
Yes.
For you, was that like, why was that confronting? Did it feel like going backwards? Or
It,
what was confronting about that?
yeah, it was almost, it felt invalidating to me. Like,
Okay.
in my mind, I came into therapy with like my full armor on, ready to fight this thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I had on my boxing gloves, and it was interesting as I reflect back on those months of
Mm.
time spent with her, that I was literally coming in, sitting at the front edge of the couch. Like I
Mm.
wasn't even relaxing into the couch, let alone pain.
Yeah.
I
Wow.
and ready to just attack so we could get over this, so I could get on with my life
Yeah.
and get back to the norm. And so when she said it, it felt like invalidating. Like,
Mm.
wait, you're not here to fight with me? You want me just to sit back and pretend like this isn't happening and act like that's okay? That's how I perceived it. And
Wow.
so I was pretty angry with her. I think I probably skipped a couple of visits. And when I finally decided to go back, she revisited that question. And for whatever reason, I will give God all the credit. My heart was open to receive that. And almost in an instant in the visit, I shrunk back into the couch and wept, really for the first time since my mom had died.
Wow.
Um, and I remember that instead of feeling, the embarrassment and all the things that I had been feeling,
Mm.
I felt almost as if, what a relief. I don't have to put on the face in here. I can cry.
Yeah.
I can do whatever it takes to be present in this painful moment. And that's when I realized that I had been holding my breath for, months after my
Mm.
mom died. So to me, relaxing in the pain is literally that emotional, that spiritual, that fear, that physical surrender, that breath to be able to say, this is where I am. This is how I feel. This is what it is. And while I don't like it, I don't want it, I wouldn't have asked for it, I'm here, right?
Yeah.
And I've got to sit with that and look around and survey what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And when I did that, Adriel, I realized that um, I had been living months alone in a vacuum, isolated, because I was too afraid to ask for help.
Mm.
I was lying to God, even though He knew that. I didn't know that. I thought I was being a good Christian by
Yeah.
saving face and constantly talking about, God was going to help me overcome, and He did. But the reality was, He was waiting for me to finally look that situation in the face and
Yeah.
release all the things I had been holding on to so that I could actually start the healing process.
Mm. So good. I just hear you giving us permission to exhale, giving permission to exhale.
Yes.
And I hope this is my prayer that those who are listening and watching right now even would take a moment and just
Mm,
exhale, because it is an invitation, isn't it?
it is. It
Um,
is.
thank you. Thank you for sharing. Not just one of the things I really appreciate you, Mekel, is that it's not theory for you. You have all of this experience and expertise as a professional, but
Hmm.
I'm so grateful that you're willing to let us into your personal process. And I think it's actually
Yeah.
really helpful to
Mm.
hear someone like you who would encourage others to seek help. You actually found it hard to seek help.
Oh, yeah.
Um, can you tell us? So you've just described what that was like for you. Can you tell
Hmm.
us, how do we know when we're holding our breath? How do we know when we actually need to pursue some help? Whether that is, talking to a pastor or letting a friend in or seeing someone in a professional capacity.
Mm-hmm.
How do we know, for those of us who are not disarmed,
Mm-hmm.
or still holding our breath or still trying to keep it all together because maybe we have jobs and other people to take care of and a life that's not on hold when we're in
Right.
pain and when we're
Mm-hmm.
grieving? How do we know when we need to exhale?
Yeah.
And how do we actually do that
I think,
without falling apart? Or is this an
yeah.
invitation to fall apart?
Well, you know what? There's a book, I believe the author's name is Megan Levine, and the title of the book is It's Okay to Not Be Okay.
Mm,
So I think there are certainly moments where it's okay to fall apart. Now, we can't stay there,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I think it's okay for us to weep on the floor, as I describe in my book, on a hotel floor the night before I'm giving a presentation on grief. I think it's okay to do that.
God
Yeah.
bless you.
Look, weeping may endure for a night, and literally
Yeah,
that night it did. And joy came in the morning. It wasn't that next morning; it was a metaphorical morning.
yeah,
However,
yeah,
yeah, it's okay to dwell in those moments for pockets of time, but we
yeah.
can't linger there. So I think we've got to
Mm,
really look at, as I mentioned before, that functional impairment, right?
mm-hmm,
We know ourselves and who we were, how we responded to things before our loss.
mm-hmm.
And so we've almost got to go back into our mental Rolodex and say, gosh, what's my norm? What's my baseline? For me, it
Yeah,
was extroverted. For me, it was hosting events at my home. For me, it was picking up the phone, not only to check on other people, but just to share what was happening with my own life. For me, it was being comforted and allowing myself to receive comfort from people. And I realized I wasn't doing any of that. I was driving downtown LA to go to work, and I was coming home and hiding out eating popcorn with my beagle. It
right.
was monotonous. So I think we've got to ask ourselves, is how I am today on the heels of this loss extremely different than what I was before, right?
Mm,
What is the functional impairment? Then we've got to say, am I having trouble getting up, combing my hair, brushing my teeth, taking a shower? Those are real things that happen to people once we
yes, they
get into
are.
that debilitating
Yeah.
chronic grief phase. So again, functional impairment.
Mm,
The other thing I think we've got to do is lean on the people who know us best, our
mm,
closest friends, our closest family, and God.
mm-hmm.
I had a moment where I was walking along Venice Beach when I lived in LA, and I was alone, as I always really was at the time. But it was the middle of the night in Venice Beach, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. But I remember asking God to show me what I needed.
Yeah.
And when he did, when I allowed that through many, many tears on the sand, he's like, Mekel, you need to ask for help. You need to
Mm,
stop lying to people when they
mm-hmm.
call and ask how you're doing. Stop saying I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
Stop saying I don't need anything. I can take care of it. And
Yeah.
stop deflecting. I was the master at that. People would call because they knew I was a professional psychologist, and when people would call and ask how I was doing, I would turn it into, hey, what's going on with you? How
Mm-hmm.
can I serve you? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, God revealed to me that I needed to ask for help. But we've got to lean on the people who know us well, who we are open to receiving input from, to say, Mekel, that's really different than
Yeah.
who I know you to be. It may be time for you to ask for professional help. And thank
Yeah.
God I listened to that voice and did at the
That's so
time.
helpful. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so helpful. So when we are in the middle of it, like right now, this is what you're describing on
Mhm.
Venice Beach. You are in the middle of it. When we are grieving, when we're in pain, we often feel such a diminished capacity even to take care of ourselves.
Right.
How do we continue to lean in? How do we trust God? How do we um, how do we sustain in the midst of that? I mean, can you give us like a 3-step program? Like, can we please have all the keys? No, I'm joking, but and obviously we don't want to be prescriptive, but
Right.
what are the things that you have found that have been life-giving,
Hmm.
maybe in your own life and observing in your clients' lives? Like, what are the things that have helped people to stay grounded and hold on to their faith in the midst of those times?
Yeah, I think, one of the practices that I utilize and I'll share with my clients is to wake up daily and before we really do anything else, right? And this may rub some biblical, ultra conservative Christian folks the wrong way, right? But I think we need to wake up and admit how we feel. Now,
Hmm.
again, the purpose of this is not to say, this is how I feel, the whole day is going to feel like this and linger there. No.
Mm-hmm.
But in our society, we are horrible at naming reality.
Hmm.
We want to avoid pain at all cost. We will lie about it. We will bury it. We will put it on a shelf and put the top on it. And so waking up in the morning, and of course, upon taking that breath and thanking God, to say, let me check in with myself. How am I feeling? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So naming it is really important. And then
Mm-hmm.
on the heels of that, so that we don't get stuck there for the day,
Mm-hmm.
to say, all right, I woke up and this morning I'm feeling angry, right? That may be the emotion that comes to the surface. What can I do to address that so that it doesn't become a ripple effect? And we already know, right? As a man thinks, so is he. So if we're waking up and this is the first thing on our minds,
Mm-hmm.
we can become that. Our day can become that. What can we do to challenge ourselves? So, for example,
Yeah.
I'll wake up in the morning sometimes, and the first thought is, man, I'm feeling really weighted down. I feel sad. My mom or my dad are the first people in my head.
Yeah.
And I feel incredibly sad right now. And I'm okay with naming that. Then I ask, okay, what can I do to channel that? And it may be something as simple as, you know what? I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to have a conversation with my mom. I'm going to go in the kitchen and drink coffee and talk to her. It may be, I'm going to actually make her favorite breakfast, right? To kind of reframe that sadness into something that I can channel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that I don't end up dwelling there. So naming and then reframing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got to keep structure. So both of my parents were in the military. And so I was raised in a structured environment, but I think that structure is such a powerful tool to help keep us grounded. Partly because grief is the rug getting pulled out from under us, and emotionally, physically, and spiritually, it can feel as if we're all over the place. And
Yes.
so having a routine is important.
Mm-hmm.
So name it, reframe it, then we've got to embed something in our routines. For me, it's getting up after I do those two things and getting up and going for a walk. Like that is part of my daily routine. It doesn't matter if I'm at home, it doesn't matter if I'm traveling around the world. That's what I do
Mm-hmm.
as the first thing. Now, I also want to add here that for me, physical exercise is a great thing, and I highly recommend this for people because what it does on a neurochemical level is it sends impulses, it sends messages to our body, from our brain to our body,
Mm-hmm.
that while we can't change the things going on around us, we have to keep moving, we have to keep going, right? Physically getting up and walking is a reminder to me every single day that I have to keep going through the valley of the shadow of death. I
Yeah.
cannot lay there, even though I want to. I cannot, wallow, even though sometimes I want to. I've got to keep moving. It's the movement that keeps us transforming. It's the movement that keeps us walking further into our faith walk and deepening and
Yeah.
strengthening the resolve that God is calling us to in this faith journey.
Mm.
So that would be my three anchored.
That's so helpful. And I was joking when I said, please give us, 3 steps. And actually, that was really, really helpful. Those 3 things: naming, reframing, and then anchoring ourselves in some life-giving disciplines and
That's right.
practices.
That's right.
Um, Gosh, I am aware of your time, which I want to respect. Um, have so much more that I would love to ask you. I think the one thing, as I was just listening to you there at the end
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about those mornings when we just wake up weighted.
Mm-hmm.
And I am just acutely aware that we are recording this in 2020 in September. The world is in pain. I think we have seen pain expressed in the world in ways this year that my generation, at least, hasn't seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps in other parts of the world, but in Australia, where I live in America, um, we haven't seen it like it is now. And of course, I'm talking about the pandemic, but I'm also talking about just the racial reckoning that's going
Mm-hmm.
on and that
Yes.
collective pain. And one of the things you were talking about is how, because we don't often express our pain, um, we don't know how to deal with it. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
so helpful for some of us, particularly my fellow white people, to keep in mind when we are seeing loud pain around us in the world, is
Yeah.
that when that pain is bottled up, that it comes out and it's so messy.
Mm-hmm.
That for me, it has really helped me to have more empathy and to seek understanding when I've realized this is actually pain coming out. It's not,
Yeah.
we can so quickly be dismissive and think
Well,
people should behave differently. But when pain is coming out, we actually need to lean in and say, well, what's there? What's it pointing to?
yeah, and I really appreciate your awareness that the pain that we're now seeing, right, that's erupting is not based on 2020.
Right.
I think sometimes people think that like, oh, this is an isolated event. Wow, how can it be so explosive? But the reality is, with regard to the pandemic, this has been a buildup of this year, right?
Yeah.
But from a racial and social perspective, this has been a buildup of hundreds of years of tension. And
Mm.
so, one of the ways that I like to think about pain and grief is energy, right? And energy will always be directed in some way. If
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
if we internalize it day after day, month after month, year after year, it's going to be directed. Now, if it's directed inward, that can look like depression. That
Yeah.
can look like internalized anxiety,
Yeah.
or it can be external anger, right?
Yeah.
An emotional eruption. And so I think we've just got to be, as you said, just very keen observers of what's happening to people around us and ourselves so that we can not only extend compassion towards other people, but also extend grace towards ourselves in the midst of
Yes.
all the changes that we're all facing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. I think the people's framework from where we sit in our pain is just
Mm-hmm.
it's going to come out. And even just the pandemic and forcing us into change, forcing
Mm-hmm.
us into restrictions, forcing us into separation, you know
Yes. Oh, yeah.
so many types of separation. I
Mm-hmm.
am, as an Australian, I am not allowed to
Mm-hmm.
leave. I
Wow.
can't go see my family if something
Mm-hmm.
happens during COVID. I can't go visit the States without a
Mm-hmm.
special exemption,
Right.
and that is different to even someone that they're with family, but they can't visit them in hospital
Right.
when they're ill. And I think,
Yeah.
and there's so many things, people are grappling with school at home and working at home and all of these challenges. And it's really easy. I know for me, I'll just speak from my own personal experience. So easy for me to beat myself up for feeling a bit fragile in the midst of
Yeah.
all of this. And yet we have a lot stacked against us. And I so appreciate even the way, looking at some of the racial tension, the way you brought into it. This is generations.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just 2020. And I think that is
Right.
so helpful for us. So, okay. Um, we could have a whole hour just talking about that, but this is what I want to do in
Yeah.
closing, Mekel. And you can answer this any way you want. You can answer this as Mekel, the woman of faith. You can answer this as Mekel, the doctor. You can answer as Dr. Harris, whatever. But what is one thing Not that those are separate people. I know you know what I mean there. But what I'm trying to do is just give you freedom to answer this any way you want. Right now, in this moment, what is one thing that's keeping you tethered to hope?
Whew. Yeah, that's sometimes it does feel like there's Mekel and then there's these other aspects, but I will answer that with a scripture that I have been literally bathing myself in. I have it actually sticky noted right here, and it's sticky noted on my bathroom mirror, and it's sticky noted in my car because I literally need just to be surrounded by this truth.
Yeah.
And the scriptures, John chapter 11, verse 40, and I'll paraphrase, it says, "You may not understand, but I tell you, if you believe, you will see." And I got to tell you, Adriel, there are a lot of things I do not understand. And I'm not just talking about 2020. Obviously, there are a lot of things I don't understand about this year.
Yeah.
But if you believe, you will see. There's a power, and I went back and looked in the Psalms as I thought about David and just other folks in our history. God loves to use the word but, and there's so much power in that but, right? It's a shift in, I see what it is, but, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have anchored myself in this season and tried to tether myself in BUT, the but. If you believe, you will see. I am clinging to the word. I am singing the word and just trying to soak that in, because there are many things I do not understand.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
if you believe, you will see.
Amen. Amen. It's so good. That's so good. Thank you. Thank you for calling us to that. Thank you for the permission to exhale and relax into our pain. And
Yes.
so thank you for your time, Mekel. Where can we find your book? Where can we find you online? I know people are going to want to connect with you after listening to your wisdom in this session. So how do they do that?
Please do. I think I love connecting with folks offline, and I literally am tickled pink when I get emails and just messages behind the scenes about something that they heard or something that really impacted them. So on social media, if you're on Instagram or Twitter, my handle is Dr. Mekel. That's DRMEKEL. I have a Facebook page with the / Dr. Mekel. And then come over to my brand new website. It's mekelharrisphd.com, where
Great.
I am probably oversharing in areas of lifestyle and love and how to be a leader and loyalties to God and ourselves, as well as my book, which you can purchase on Amazon. Again, it's called Relaxing Into the Pain, My Journey into Grief and Beyond. And I just want to thank you, Adriel, for just being a beacon of hope, a beautiful presence inside and out, and the opportunity to share with you and your audience.
Oh, thank you, Mekel. The pleasure is all mine. I just adore you. And I'm so thankful that you would give us this time and give us just the gift of yourself. So grace to you. Bless you.
For you, it's always going to be a yes. Just know that.
Thank you, my friend. Okay, we'll talk soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.